We're back, everyone, with another very interesting presentation from OneTrust GRC. Our guests today are Scott Bridgen and Charles Allen. They are on the consultancy and offering part. So without further ado, Scott, Charles, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Fireside Chat. We're going to be hosting today on the EU NIS Directive. So my name is Charles Allen. I am the EMEA sales leader at OneTrust for the OneTrust GRC offering. And I'm joined by my colleague, Scott Bridgen, who is the global head of GRC at OneTrust. And Scott has a background of around 20 or so years working in operational risk, cybersecurity for both organizations themselves, and also a number of different vendors within the market as well. So Scott brings with him a host of knowledge, expertise, and experience within this sector that we'll hopefully be able to touch on in the discussion today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Scott Bridgen to kick off, share some information, and we'll then end with some questions as well, I imagine.
Wonderful.
Scott, over to you.
Thank you very much. So as we're talking about NIS, it's quite interesting that 2020 threw a lot of things at us. So if we can go to the next slide, what we saw was there was an increased number of cyber threats, which from our perspective, this came from different directions. If we look at it from an infrastructure perspective, there wasn't a huge amount, but we definitely saw state-sponsored and threat actors coming from afar, things that could affect us from a traditional sort of NIS perspective. And I think generally, as people transition to working from home and the new normal, as the pandemic sort of begun, we saw phishing attacks and other aspects going up quite significantly. What was interesting, though, was also emerging risk didn't stop. We basically saw everything from the digital transformation acceleration around AI, new systems, new software, data processing, the Internet of Everything. 5G still continued to begin to sort of roll out. And so as infrastructure, that was kind of all accelerated. And the other thing as well that we saw was really around resilience. Resilience seems to be a theme. And it's an interesting one, again, from an NIS perspective, because really when we're looking at the two different aspects of what NIS touches, resilience is going to be fundamentally critical because it's not just about the cybersecurity aspect, there's a physical security element to it as well. Next one, and then the extended enterprise. So from a reliance on the extended enterprise, obviously that sort of thing with third-party trust and third-party risk. And again, when we're looking at it from an NIS perspective, we have to look at actually what do third parties bring to the party and what effect could that have from a resilience perspective? And then lastly, probably the most critical part that I don't feel like any directive really considers properly is the unaware employee. And Charlie, if you give it one more click, that will bring up the rest of the information. So this is a really important factor because pre-pandemic, it was very difficult for people to be able to be inspired or interested in cybersecurity and privacy. During the pandemic, we are tired. I'm doing this from a cupboard, basically. That's why I'm hiding my screen, because my office is flooded. But we're working from home. This new normal has taken its toll on people, which means people will make mistakes. Now, if we think about that from a traditional business perspective, that can have its risks. But when we look at critical infrastructure and DSPs, that can cause significant issues because people might be worried about their jobs. They might be able to be taken advantage of or blackmailed into unleashing additional threats, vulnerabilities, or other aspects, letting people into buildings so they can access critical infrastructure. So I feel like it's a bit of a ticking time bomb. And I feel like part of the NIS directive and what we're doing, as Charlie and I are going to chat about this, we're going to talk about how we can tackle that unaware employee piece as well. Next slide. Now, I know you guys have covered the NIS, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I'll just go through a little bit on my take. So next slide. And this is interesting from our perspective because obviously, whilst it was primarily around cybersecurity measures, it does cover physical and environmental factors. So that harping back to resilience is a really, really critical aspect. And whilst there's an expectation for people to report incidents, really what we're beginning to see is organizations as part of their wider resilience program are incorporating obviously what they have to do in relation to the NIS. But anyway, next slide. And again, because you guys have had this, but what I'm finding interesting is the CISA aspect, because there is a grey set of areas about when to report and what we should report, and what the threshold is for reporting. Now, it's been listed out quite clearly in some aspects, but in others, there's still some grey areas. So Charlie and I are going to chat about this as we go through. But if we break it down for the two critical providers, obviously, we've got the OES and the DSP. What is interesting, though, is the smaller organizations that don't meet the criterion or threshold, and about actually, if they're part of the extended enterprise, so they provide critical supply or services, in the same way that the new US regulations like CMMC or the old DFARS for the defense contractors, will there be an addendum or change to the NIS that will look at actually the reliance on the extended enterprise? Because whilst it is touched on, I don't feel like it's covered in enough detail when we're talking about actually reporting incidents like processing information or other aspects like we would look in privacy. Next slide. Obviously, from the OES, we kind of know what they are and what they're going to be providing. So if we go to the next slide. What's interesting, though, is the appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational measures. And I believe it's deliberately a grey area, but still, it comes back to adequacy. And we still don't know truly what adequacy looks like from that perspective, even though this has been around a long time, as everyone knows, and different member states and different countries have got very different approaches. But this proportionate response and measures is quite significant in its sort of grey areas. Next slide. And from a DSP perspective, everything was interesting. I mean, we all know what a search engine is. We all know what an online marketplace is. I thought it was quite interesting, though, when we talk about cloud computing service and actually the scale and scope of what that is. So rather than take the traditional definition, I actually use the NIS definition, which gives it a bit more of a broader aspect. And again, it's down to obviously the DSPs to identify themselves as well as the member states to provide their opinion on this. But I feel like the broader definition would probably incorporate some more critical providers that haven't necessarily identified themselves currently. And I think that this is something, as time goes on, we are going to see more of, and this definition will broaden widely. This is the thing that I find also interesting. So from a DSP perspective, when we're talking about the incidents, again, definition of risk to public safety. There's loose-ish definitions. The loss of life thing is quite obvious, but again, the threshold for the DSPs, I wonder how many of them are making these reports. And I wonder how many of them are aware that they have to when they've done their own form of cert and their own investigation and they're going through their own remediation process. For example, with Facebook, we know that Facebook is obviously, I would class that as a critical provider of societal information. So if they have if they go down, or if there are misreported information through, paid advertising, state-sponsored disinformation, we need to understand exactly what that could mean. And also, are they going to be held account for not reporting? So it's aspects like that from a clarity perspective that worries me. But anyway, next slide. We'll get to the chat piece in a moment. And then obviously there's the EU obligations. We can move on from this as well, because you guys have covered all of this. Let's get to the good bit. I'll hand back to Charlie, and what we'll do is we'll just go through a high-level sort of Q&A and fireside based on some of what our customers have seen and their approaches, and also some best practice aspects that we've seen in relation to what the NIS actually is from that standpoint. So Charlie, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you for that introduction. I know it's obviously quite, it's not new knowledge to a lot of people on the call, but it's very good to recap on kind of some of the basics. So a few questions then that we've seen, as Scott mentioned, from a lot of our customer base. And I suppose the real one to start off with is, Scott, are there any legal obligations around this directive?
So it's interesting because it's primarily aimed at improving cybersecurity, but it's not itself a cybersecurity law because it relates to the incidents that are occurring that impact a service, say, for example, or produces like a disruptive effect or significant disruptive effect. It can be quite difficult actually from an enforcement standpoint, because you have to consider not just the traditional cyber threats, but also interruptions to power supplies or natural disasters such as earthquakes or flooding. So for an example, an organization in scope of process that have, I don't know, servers in a data center, they're subject to technical measures to prevent external attackers from infiltrating them, either physically or virtually or remotely from that perspective. However, if, say, for example, this data center that was providing critical infrastructure has during, I don't know, routine maintenance or an adverse weather effect, loses loss of power and gets disconnected, then unless that organization has, multiple redundancies and backups, that is classed as a disruptive effect and therefore is classed as an incident or defined as an incident by the NIS, even though no cyber attack has caused it. And so even though it's not legislation like law, traditional law, there is a huge level of responsibility placed on both the providers and the member states to have a handle of this. And the thing is you don't want it to be a newsworthy item from that perspective, where people start to look at your organization because it's on the news first rather than being reported to the relevant authority internally.
So just one more question along the same sort of lines. We've seen, obviously, over the past 4 or so years now, that GDPR becoming a privacy regulation has meant that businesses put a lot of resource, money, people resource into complying with that. Do you think that security teams potentially have a bit of a struggle in getting the resource they need from businesses because this is a directive and not such a legal obligation like a regulation might be?
Yeah, so that's interesting because privacy laws and some security laws naturally have very much focused on data instead of the information system as a whole. So something like the NIS is looking obviously broader at the categorization of cybersecurity and all of the sort of downstream effects from that perspective. And so it's interesting because we've had the CIS in United States, Canada's got some cybersecurity initiatives. And so I think it's cool and also long overdue that the NIS actually is focusing primarily on the infrastructure and physical security and the cybersecurity piece. So we're looking at everything as a whole rather than just the data that resides on it and the rights and freedoms of the affected individuals, say, for example. So yeah, it's an interesting piece.
Good. So as an organization, then how do I know if this directive applies to me or not?
So it's interesting again, because realistically, the EU member states should have put people in place that would automatically identify. So we have the sort of mandated identification, which comes from the member state itself. And then we have the self-identification, which comes from whichever area that it falls in, whether it's a DSP, etc. So it can be quite difficult, but realistically, the definitions are there. Although, however, the DSPs can be a little bit more of a grey area in comparison to essential services. But in saying that, essential services can be defined in different ways by different countries. Take, for example, railways and train operators. What would be classed as a critical infrastructure or critical services? Is it the number of people or passengers that are carried daily, weekly, monthly, hourly? Is it in relation to the facilities that they provide or other aspects that they're performing? So there has been some great areas on identification, but realistically, most organizations by now should know. But I would be very surprised. Sorry, I wouldn't be very surprised if there were some that hadn't self-identified or been told as of yet. Because I still think the NIS directive is a relatively well-kept secret, which sounds ridiculous. But if you speak to people outside of the cybersecurity profession, more on the resilient side of the business, or if we even look at sort of CEOs, I would say that a lot of them that aren't directly involved are 100% aware of it.
Okay. So then what do I need to do? And if, going back to the last question, I find out, for example, that it is applicable to me, what are the first steps that I need to ensure that I'm doing to comply, but also ensure that the company's in a good state as well from a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, and this is where some of the problems can arise, because one of the first things that you're expected to do, and that everyone, so if you go to any of the big consultancies, one of the first things they'll tell you to do is take a risk-based approach to your assets, only focus on your critical assets. We're going to touch on that later on in the conversation, but which I wholeheartedly agree with, because you need to focus on what is critical within the infrastructure and environment. But going back to the people part of the problem, I would say that it extends beyond that. So people should look at obviously identifying and delineating the critical digital assets and infrastructure networks that support the services that they provide. That's point number one, and very obvious. And you only focus around that. But then off of the back of BIAs, risk assessments, gap analysis, and maturity planning, what you also need to do is look at the people part. So the people part, actually the traditional risks that would be normally captured in a very traditional IT or cyber risk environment, but looking at who has access, who, why they have access, the reliance on the extended enterprise, like suppliers and contractors form part of this. And actually that does come into the recommendations. But actually what we want to do is start looking at that from how are we checking to make sure that the people that say they are actually are who they say they are. So have we improved physical security checks? Have we done or improved background checks with the vendors that we're working with? During the pandemic, for example, has there been a change? Because the pandemic changed a lot of things. The extended enterprise were under pressure themselves to continue to operate, and they might have had to contract or outsource. And so we go deeper into the extended enterprise, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth parties down the line. And this was probably an exercise that a lot of organizations did just from a resilience perspective themselves. You know, can we continue to deliver widgets, customer satisfaction, the services that we're there to provide? But from an NIS directive perspective, did they look at the people part of the problem properly in relation to actually complying? And when I say complying, obviously that's a kind of a gray statement, but really it makes sense to go back into your existing frameworks. So all of the frameworks that we already have in place. So ISACA's COBIT, IRAM2, your NIST, your Marguerites, whatever from that perspective, your SOC 2s, all of those frameworks are good. But as we're only focusing on the critical assets, it makes sense to look at the controls, the processes, the people, the access, the vendor aspect, and really, really focus on that. And then also you need to make sure that your incident reporting process is up to date. It's not just about having a really good internal process. It's about actually having the right investigation process piece and making sure that you've got not just the way to investigate it yourself, but you need to understand, you know, key and critical root cause analysis from a PR perspective, how that's messaged fundamentally. And I think, again, this is a thing that we don't always look at in the world of cyber. I used to work for NATO many, many years ago, and that took me all over the world, predominantly in a diplomatic role between the North America and the European Union. And the amount of PR and spin that the North American teams had in comparison to Europe when we were faced with certain problems that could get out to the public was significant. And I don't think we do that well enough in Europe. I feel like we closed ranks, we shut the doors, and we don't often look at actually how we would potentially address this from a PR perspective as well.
Good, and this leads me on to I suppose really one of the key question, and the one that we receive most often from customers. So what would be your recommended practical steps? And you can start at the beginning or wherever you feel on the process, but what would you recommend to customers?
Yeah, so it starts with the assets anyway, right? That's unavoidable. Break it down into the very traditional ways that GRC has taught us, that I feel like we've strayed further and further away from as the digital transformation stroke evolution has taken place, which is people, process, technology. It's not just about the technology. We start actually with the technology, however, so we do high level risk analysis on just the critical assets. And we just give that initial overview. We focus on working out where data is, what they provide, how that intrinsically links to process. So identifying the critical processes and dependencies. What's the downstream effect from that perspective? If you can map it physically or draw it, that is even better, because the visual aspect allows you then to work out ownership. Ownership. This is one of the big things that, again, I don't feel organizations look at enough. We'll just focus on actually some of the critical assets, what they have, and the processes. We need to make sure that we have named people, they have a responsibility, they retain the risks from their perspective, and they retain control ownership if applicable. We also need to know what boundaries there are as well. So what separates our critical assets from other assets? Is that defined? Is that written down? Is there policy? Is there documentation? Can we translate that? Then we need to understand the regulatory requirements of the inventory. So making sure that we've got a really, really clear indication of what that looks like. And then we can go into deeper analysis, whether that's further risk assessments, risk and control self-assessments. Then we need to look at the target strategy. And more importantly, this is where we start to look at the people part. Excuse me. The people part of the problem comes into this. Who has access? What can they do? What they should be able to do? And that's when we tie all of that back. So we start to get the bigger picture, the critical assets we've identified, the people part of that, the processes that brings together. We've then got this 360-degree view, and we can start to run playbooks. And building the playbook out, this is something that customers have asked us a lot about. I mean, obviously we need to make sure that the audit aspect, and I know that you guys have been talking, the ISACA chapter have been talking about audits, so I didn't want to go too deeply into that. However, obviously being audit ready is absolutely fundamentally critical, and making sure also that we do pre-audits and gap analysis audits as well. But we need to then define a roadmap and make sure that it has aspirational as well as practical. And then we need to have responsibilities. And it goes back to the people piece and looking at the dependencies on the extended enterprise. Then, and one of the most important things is testing. It comes back to the resilience. And it's not necessarily traditional business continuity and disaster recovery. It's operational resilience. It's running through those high-level exercises and saying, okay, let's look at a terrorist attack incident. Let's look at a natural disaster. Let's look at a combination of the two. Let's look at socioeconomic, political situation. Let's look at threat actors from outside of our country, and running through not just individual aspects, but a combined play. Because let's be honest, things don't often happen in isolation. Although, you know, DSPs probably will look at, they've got a slightly easier task. When we're providing critical infrastructure, critical services, that becomes harder, because trying to, you know, recreate a nuclear meltdown can be quite a big or significant undertaking for an organization as an exercise. But again, having that playbook piece, and a lot of these things are already in play. So these aren't new activities or initiatives for organizations. It's a refinement that we can then prepare and make sure we've got the right reporting capability to ensure that we can inform the authorities within the member states that are affected. Because obviously this isn't just going to be our own country. There's a very good chance we're providing services that fall outside of our jurisdictional boundaries. So we need to make sure that we're ready for everyone's input. I feel like that's kind of most of it what you want to do, but you've got to take a risk-based approach. I hate checkbox exercises and the sort of typical compliance-based approaches that businesses like to take. Take a risk-based approach. That always informs you better, and also gives you the ability to work out a quantitative and qualitative approach.
Got it. And so if there's one bit of advice in terms of that risk-based approach, what would it be? Would it be using assessments? Would it be engaging the first line, the second line of the business? Or is there something else?
Yeah, this is a second and third line initiative, but it can only work with 70% of the first line that are involved in this fully engaged, because they're going to be able to help you identify things that you might not, blind spots basically, as part of these processes. Because the cyber world is relatively, it's not tangible, but all of us as ISACA members, we can put our arms around it. And it's a world that we feel very comfortable in. When we start talking about physical security, it might not be our remit. Not every CISO or information security manager or controls assurance manager looks after physical security. Depending on the type of organization you're in, that could fall to multiple people or another individual. So it's making sure that we can actually put our arms completely around it. And when you do a risk-based approach, starting with a good assessment on how, once I've identified my critical assets, how ready is the business? Is the first line trained and engaged? Do they have levels of ownership? Do we know who owns what? Can we get them to help us identify those blind spots? Definitely an assessment-based approach from that perspective.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Scott. And I appreciate we're very close to time. So thank you, everybody, for listening. I've been Charles Allen. I'm sales leader at OneTrust GRC, and Scott Bridgen, who's our global head of GRC. Please feel free to get in touch if you have any further questions, want to speak to us further about how we've helped customers with this specific topic. But I'll hand back to the ISACA team, and thank you all for listening. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Charles. Now we're gonna head on to the next presentation in just 1 or 2 minutes. Please do stay online for that. It's gonna be a very interesting subject, that's for sure. Thank you very much.